Hello, today we are going to be talking about the concept of overlapping. Overlapping is probably something that you're maybe a little familiar with when it comes to art. It is something that we talk about and you do come in contact with all the time in your regular life because it simply has to do with the idea that when an object is in front of another object, the object in behind, so if this pencil is in front of the red pencil, then the part of the red pencil that the blue pencil is in front of is hidden and we can't see it. The blue pencil is overlapping the red pencil. The red pencil is overlapping the sketchbook. The sketchbook is overlapping the table. So when things are placed in front of or on top of each other, the ones in behind are being overlapped by the objects that are in the front. And when we're drawing, it's really important, if we're trying to create that sense of depth or give the illusion of it, that we incorporate that into our sketches as well. A lot of the times people will try and fit in an entire object, even though in real life we wouldn't be able to see it, and it starts making the drawing look a little bit weird and wonky. And so what you have to do is really start taking a look at the objects that you're drawing, and if something is overlapped and you don't see it, don't worry, your brain is going to fill in the gaps. When your eye is looking at it, it does it in real life, and it's going to do it in your drawings as well. So let's do a couple of practices to kind of get you comfortable with that and understanding how you can use overlapping in your own work. So let's just start nice and simple. I'm going to do a cylinder. So I know I start with my foreshortened circle. With my foreshortened circle, I'm then going to come down with 2 vertical lines straight down, and remember our little technique if we're not sure if they're totally straight up and down. And then finally, we're going to cap it off with a round or a curved line that mimics the curve up above. We know that that is one of the most important lines to really create that idea of volume and three-dimensionality. So here we have our cylinder, awesome. Last week or last lesson, whenever you completed it, we were talking about size and placement on page. So overlapping is going to work really hand in hand with both of those concepts. Last time I was showing you how the size gets smaller the further away an object is. Right? And not only does it get slightly smaller, but also we know that its placement on the page gets higher. So remember, the closer to the top of the page your object, the further away it's going to feel to the viewer. So when we're talking about placement on page 2, it's really important, I might have mentioned this last week, but it's important enough to mention again, that you're thinking about where its placement is in relation to the bottom of the object. So I'm not looking at where the top of it lies, I'm actually looking at where does the bottom of the object hit on my page, and that's telling me where its placement is. Because I could, in theory, have a really large canister that maybe is taking up, maybe it's really big. And it's so big that if this was my paper, it's actually, see that it's actually coming off the top of the paper, or coming almost to the top, or it could even be going right to the top. So it's higher at the top than this one. But if I think about where the bottom would be, the bottom is still a lot lower than even this one. So you always want to think about where its placement in pages in relation to the bottom of the object. So last week when we were doing this, we were working with size, we were working with placement on paper, but what we weren't really doing, we were keeping all of our objects really separate. So there was no overlapping, nothing was being hidden, nothing was in front of a different object. And so today what we're going to do is start kind of playing around with the idea of overlapping, because most of the time objects aren't going to be perfectly placed out like this. There's going to be a lot of times where we have objects in behind one another, in front of each other, and so we need to know how to draw that as well. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to imagine these are a bunch of cans. I'm going to draw another can that's going to be behind this one, and it's also going to be behind this one. So what's going to happen is this is where I need to start kind of thinking about or imagining, and if you want to use your guidelines and draw them in really lightly, you're more than welcome to do that as well. And so what I want to do is kind of think about where this object would be. I know I want it to be slightly higher. further away than this one. So it needs to be higher up on the page. So I'm going to draw the top of it higher because I know that means the bottom will also be higher than this one. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to draw in the lines that are going to be seen, that are not being overlapped by the object that's in front of it. So right now, I can go in and darken that. This line I could see, but then this cylinder is blocking or overlapping the rest, but I would still see the bottom. And it's really important to think about that curve and to start the curve and continue it so that it really feels like it's going to curve right around and join up. Then what you can do is, if you did use any guidelines, and it's completely okay to do that, artists use them all the time, and that's why it's nice to have a bit of a light hand when you first start kind of mapping things down, because then you can erase whatever you overlapped. And now it really looks like this one is behind both this canister and this one. And I'll erase, I don't know if you can see that on the tape, but I'll just erase that. So it looks really, really great. I've overlapped, I've thought about placement on page, and it is slightly smaller than this one. Again, if I wanted to overlap a second one, maybe this one's right behind. I'm going to do the same thing. And I'm only putting in what I can see. I'm not trying to squeeze in extra. I'm not trying to make it fit in a different way than what it naturally would do. Okay. These look like kind of like a row of cans. I could even have, and this is where, you know, it doesn't have to always be the same size either. Maybe these are cans of soup, and now I'm going to have a tuna can or something. We know that those are a lot smaller, or sorry, shorter. So what I'm going to do is I still want it to be kind of at the same level as this one, but I know that it's going to be a smaller size. And so again, I'm just going to do my foreshortened circle, my 2 lines, then I'm going to join them up. And then I'm going to go in and erase whatever this can would be overlapping from this one in behind. And now it kind of looks like, oh yeah, there's a smaller canister here. That's awesome. Looks a little bit more realistic. And just kind of emphasizes the idea that it doesn't have to, just because it's smaller doesn't necessarily mean that it looks like it's further in the distance. It could just be a smaller can or canister. So that is how you use overlapping. I would encourage you to draw a few more cans, put them in. And then if you really wanted to practice, something I would encourage you to do is just to even think about, maybe these are cans and you're going to put some labels on them. So when we first start with our labels, the key to remember is that your line in your label is also going to follow this curved line, and the bottom of the label will do the same thing. These are going to be straight up and down. And then you can write your word on it, or you can draw whatever. Maybe this is tomatoes. There's a little can of tomatoes in here. Whatever you like. But then what I would encourage you to do is play around, because a lot of the times when we put things into our cupboards or when we see things in life, they're not orderly and put in so that all the labels are facing the same way, or that all the objects are in the same direction. And so what you want to start doing is playing around with the idea that, yeah, sometimes when I'm looking, not only is this behind an overlap, but maybe it's a little bit turned. So I'm going to draw my label, and again, this is where a lot of my students will start, they'll squeeze this tomato and they'll put it right here. Well, in real life, if you take a can and you start moving it or twisting it, the label does not move with it. And so what you need to be comfortable with doing is realizing that sometimes I'm only going to see part of this because it's going to be overlapped. And the fact is, it doesn't look weird when you're looking at your drawing. Your brain just, again, compensates and says, oh, okay, it's just a turned can, no problem, not a big deal. So I would go in, if I were you, play around with maybe doing that with your labels. You could add some different labels. You could put lettering on some of your labels. Maybe this is a can of peas or something. And notice I didn't put the P because the P would be on the other side. So I'm not getting too worried because this is really just what I would be able to see. Maybe this one I'd only be able to see part of the P. Maybe not even all of it. and that's okay. So I would go in, maybe throw in a few cans, really playing around with overlapping, playing around with placement on page. And then of course, you guys are superstars at your shading and your shadows. And so you can start doing that too. So just remember that your shadows are always on the ground. You have to think about where your light source is coming from. And again, depending if these are covering, then you may have more shadow because it's a fuller cupboard. But always remembering to keep your shadows horizontal. They can come out in front, but you don't want them going down, right? You want to keep that horizontal line because it just visually makes you think, oh, okay, that's the horizon. They're all on ground. Perfect. And then again, you can go in and you can do some shading if you want. And this just makes everything, you can even add like some, you know how sometimes they have the sort of ridges? So you could add that if you wanted. So you can have a lot of fun with this and just play around with it. And you can see how this using overlapping is really giving you a lot of freedom now to place your objects wherever you want them. They don't have to just be spaced out with nothing touching. I guess there's social distancing, but your cans don't need to do that. There we go. I could have a big label on this. This is like a really up close one. And again, maybe it's so big that I'm only going to see part of that tomato. I'm not going to see the whole thing. But again, if this is the size of my paper, I'm not worried about it. I know that everyone's brain is filling this in and making it make sense. So it's okay. So I would encourage you to play around with that and just get really comfortable with your overlapping. You can definitely, throw in some spheres or some cubes or whatever objects you've been practicing and play around with your shading, that kind of a thing. And that'll just get you really comfortable with this concept. After that, know that you can use overlapping. You see it all the time because it's basically what a landscape consists of as well. So if we are creating a landscape type drawing, for example, I'm just going to kind of put, if this was pretend this is just the perimeter of my paper. So if I'm creating my landscape is actually broken up into 4 parts. You may already know this. The front part is the part that's closest to you, and it's known as the foreground. The second part is in the middle. It's known as the midground. The third part is at the back. It's the background. And the fourth is up in the air, and it's the sky. So even when you think foreground, midground, background, notice it's following the same rules as our placement on page, with our foreground, the ground at the front being closest to us and being at the bottom of the page. The background being higher at the back, higher on your page at the top, and so then giving the illusion that it's further back, and the mid-ground laying between them. And so what you can actually do is start playing around a little bit with some of these ideas. So you could even have, some nice little terrain or some grass. This is my foreground grass. Maybe I'm going to have some hills. Notice these are in my midground, even though this hill is going up into my background. That I don't care. That doesn't matter. It's where the bottom is. Then maybe I'm going to have some little mountains kind of going in my background. And again, these mountains are being overlapped. See that? By the hills that are in the back, or by the midground. The background mountains are overlapping the sky. And then we can even start getting kind of fancy. Maybe we want to have like a cool river or stream or something that's coming So here, where my foreground is overlapping my midground, I can actually just start, I'm going to make this my stream. Notice I'm thinking about placement on page. So the closer the stream is to us, the further it is. So this one's coming right off the page. So it's almost like we're walking right towards it. As we're going further in space, it gets a little more narrow. It's getting smaller and it's also getting higher on the page. And then it's really cool because, you know, these types of streams can kind of meander off into the background. So maybe it goes down and around and up. And so I can take this stream and again, I'm rounding it. I'm making it wider or a little bit bigger, further down, closer to the viewer and lower on the page. It gets a little smaller as it gets higher up on the page and farther away from the viewer until it really gets to the point where it just kind of goes right off into the distance. See that? And so that kind of creates the illusion now of, you know, taking these concepts and these simple shapes that we've been using and then now turning them into maybe something cool like a landscape drawing, which is different than what we've been doing up until now. And then, of course, you want to, with overlapping, you do want to use your eraser to get rid of anything that is no longer going to be visible because the object is now behind it. And then we can think about also our other concept of detail. So obviously what I see up here is going to be very different than the detail I see closer to me. So maybe I happen to see that there's, you know, some grass and maybe some reeds and things like that. Maybe a little bulrush or cattail, that kind of thing. And again, that's like a foreshortened cylinder. We've got some reeds all along the side. I'm having them go up. So again, vertically, straight up. Looks good. Maybe there's a little rock and another rock that's overlapping. It's in front of this one, and some grass that's kind of, it's sitting on. So you can see I'm having a lot more detail the closer that this is to the viewer because I can see it. Whereas maybe if there's a little rock back here, I can't really see it quite as well. I definitely can't see the same kind of detail. Maybe I just see a little bit of shadow where the reeds and the grass are. And here I probably don't see much of anything. And then again, you can decide on your light source. You can start adding some shading. My mountains, if this mountain is in front of, I can start making decisions like that. Which one is in front of the other? Maybe this is going to be the front mountain. Then this one is in behind. And so the way I shade it is going to be a little bit different as well. And I can really start adding and building up the illusion and depth in this picture just by using those techniques that we've already learned together in previous sessions and incorporating it with overlapping. All right. And again, you could go in and start like shading this or adding more details, you know, that kind of a thing, adding some shading on my rocks. You can really get in there and be as detailed as you want, and the more techniques that you implement, just the greater the illusion you're going to get. Maybe this is a little bit farther back so I can't see it. It's being overlapped a bit. So you can see even with the hills, I can shade and it can kind of give that illusion. Looks really cool. And again, depending on what kind of shading I'm using, can kind of give it the feel of whether it's grass or whether it's something really smooth or rocky. So you can really play around with it, have a lot of fun, and create some pretty cool drawings, really, based on these techniques. All right, so I would encourage you to play around with this, see what you can come up with. Maybe create a landscape of your own. Maybe look out the window and see what's out there. Maybe there's a great landscape that's got lots of overlapping and shadow that you can kind of play around with. And the more you do that, the better your skills are going to get and the greater the illusion your sketches are going to have of depth and dimensionality. So well done, that's overlapping. Thanks for joining me, and I will see you next time.